a haven, an oasis, a wonderful place, and not somewhere to be scared of. Everybody in North Wales knows about Denbigh. Denbigh is a local nut house. And if you don't go and look at Denbigh and don't see what Denbigh's about, that's a perception you have. I envisaged a massive grey Victorian building with high walls and sort of people shuffling around in their night clothes in the grounds and being herded in and controlled and sat under trees, and control was a big thing. There was no sort of freedom of expression or letting your feelings out or talking about things. It was all about, as far as I was concerned, you know, heavy drugs and people really who should be locked away behind high walls. That was my perception of Denbigh.
Denbigh Hospital, known initially as the North Wales Counties Lunatic Asylum, was opened in November 1848. It was intended to cater for 200 patients, but by the turn of the century, it housed 1,000. Before this time, the majority of mentally ill people had been kept at home and treated inhumanely. They were locked away in cellars and chained to the walls, and the treatments were often barbaric. The opening of the hospital represented a great success for the small group of subscribers, professional men from the Denbigh area. They demanded that the North Wales counties unite and establish a Welsh hospital and replace the abandonment and neglect of a large number of Welsh pauper lunatics with kind management. By the early 1840s, many asylums had appeared in England, but North Wales was still without one, and the Welsh pauper lunatics were sent to England, where they were confronted with an additional problem: communication.
And this problem was picked up by Dr. Samuel Hitch, who was a medical superintendent in Gloucester Lunatic Asylum, and he wrote a letter to the Times newspaper, and you can see the letter here, which basically talks about the Welsh pauper lunatic being badly treated by the keepers or attendants in these English asylums because they couldn't understand each other. And one sentence there sums it all up. It is proverbial in our English asylums that the Welshman is the most turbulent patient wherever he comes an inmate. And this was all down to poor communications with the Welsh language. Of course, the majority of pauper Welsh people in those days couldn't speak English anyway. I came to Denbigh Hospital in 1965 as a nursing assistant, and at that time I was waiting to go into Teachers Training College, but I liked it so much here that I decided to stay and do my training. What triggered off my interest in the history of the place was the fact that it was closing. A few of us got together about 5 or 6 years ago now because things were starting to change, and we thought that it was important that we kept as much of this as we could together.
And on my first day, after getting into uniform, they told me to go up to a dormitory. Not knowing what to do, I asked one of the nurses, and she said, "You can get her up." And when I went and got her up, she smacked me in the mouth, straight in the mouth. No messing. I nearly ran home, you know.
The rumour was that to get a job here, you had to play a musical instrument or play a sport. I was a soccer player. That's how I came to work here. They needed a goalkeeper in their soccer team, and I got a job as a kitchen porter. The rumour is in the kitchen still that I'm the only man to start at the bottom and work down, really.
One of the first things I was asked by Dr. Frank Jones, who was the medical superintendent at the time, do you play a musical instrument? And I said, yes, I do play the piano. And I think people said after, oh, you know, that did help, because he liked someone, he was very musical himself, and he liked people to, so that for the patient's benefit, I mean, that we could entertain the patients, you see. And I used to. There was a grand piano on the ward I worked on when I was junior, and often used to play, and they'd sing and enjoy themselves, you know.
Admission date, 16th of April, 1875. Name?
Thomas Morris.
Pauper?
Yes.
Age?
46.
Where are you from?
BRYN, Bethesda, Carnarvonshire.
Previous occupation?
Quarryman.
Medical certificate. Inattentive to his duties. Also under the impression that his neighbours and fellow workmen are against him, and saying that he is anxious to go to his father, sister and children who are dead. The Penryn quarrymen were on strike, but he was one of the few who kept on working. On admission, he was extremely low and unhappy, moaning and shedding tears. He said that his mind had given way, and that everybody, as he thought, were conspiring against him, and that he was now being punished for his sins.
We took the decision to concentrate on analysing the case notes of patients who were in the asylum. This is something that hasn't really been done on any scale before, partly because of the nature of the documents that are actually very difficult to read. It's a very slow process. Also because the enormous amount of information you actually get in the case notes, it is difficult to quite work out what on earth you could do with it all. So we chose to enter it all into a database. From the opening of the asylum in 1848, the following century, there were in fact 17,000 patients admitted to the hospital. So there was no way we could possibly deal with all of those. So we decided to do a systematic sample, and we chose a 1 in 10 sample of all the patients. Well, if you could finish up on these cases, Alice, and then if you could save the data onto the floppy for me tonight, I can take it home and load it up on my computer at home again.
That's fine.
There's an enormous amount of detail in the case histories, which indicate to us the sort of reasons why people were actually sent to the hospital. They had to be sent with a certificate which had to be signed by a doctor and had to have his evidence plus the evidence he derived from other people who knew and could report on the behaviour of the patient, and it had to be signed by a magistrate. So they came with a legal document if they were pauper patients, which most of them were. There were a few private patients, and the certification process was slightly different for them. You had to have 2 doctors. Also, by and large, the actual certifications are very revealing because they tell us how the patient came to the asylum, and we found certain patterns. A number of them had been in workhouses and had been very difficult and unmanageable, tearing up the bed sheets, being noisy all night, being violent to the staff, various reasons such as that. And so they came. A number of people came via the police if they were picked up wandering or undressing in public or behaving strangely in a threatening manner to people. But the surprising thing is that a lot of people actually came because their families had referred them. I think they are quite a unique historical document because they tell us such an enormous amount of detail about the domestic circumstances, about problems at work, problems in society, and enormously in-depth insight into the sort of problems of the day, the fears of people, their apprehensions, the sort of things that they got excited about or worried about, the enormous influence of religion, of course. And many of the tales, of course, are really very, very harrowing and very, very sad. But amongst the cases, there are some who, in fact, recover, and you can see that, in fact, the asylum did provide well, if not therapy, at least a chance to recuperate and to recover from their illness.
When the hospital first opened, there was very little in the way of treatment. In fact, there was nothing of any significance until about the 1930s. So, obviously what I'm saying is that for the first 70 or 80 years, treatments were very limited. And patients were either expected to work within the hospital, and in fact the hospital couldn't have functioned without that workforce, or if they couldn't work, if they were too ill, they spent most of their time walking around the airing courts.
We had the farm, that was a type of occupational therapy on a large number of patients. In the early days, used to go on the farm and work in the gardens. Then over the years, they thought this was, you know, exploitation of patient labour, so they did away with it. The farm was sold, of course, in 1956, I think, 57. It was a thriving farm, and it was produced, you know, all requirements for the needs of the hospital, you know, milk, meat, and vegetables, the gardens rather.
The whole hospital was a factory in its working. The catering was self-sufficient almost, so baking bread, had their own bread slicing machine. The laundry was done here, painting, tinsmith, upholsterers, joiners. Really, most of the upkeep of the hospital was done internally. It was only when a big project needed doing, like the building of a new ward or something, that they brought out outside contractors.
May 1875. Name?
Margaret Roberts.
Pauper?
Yes.
Age?
69.
Where are you from?
Llanrwst.
Previous occupation?
Lodging housekeeper.
Medical certificate. Says that there is a fire in the house and that it is beset with insects. States that they constantly try to poison her.
Her son, a collier in South Wales, a married man, has got into difficulties during the present strike, and she has been obliged to help him. This appears to have preyed upon her mind, and as she was not very well off, she was very much afraid of getting into debt. Was placed in number 6 ward.
My mother was a psychiatric nurse in Tooting Bec in London for years before she got married. So I grew up knowing that people did get chained to beds and they were heavily sedated. There was bars on windows and straitjackets and padded cells and all the rest of it. And my father always used to say that, for example, cancer doesn't respect blue eyes and golden hair. Well, mental illness is the same. It doesn't matter what your race, religion, sex, or social status is, it will get you if that's going to happen. But the interesting thing is that if you're wealthy or privileged, you're eccentric. If you're not wealthy or privileged, you're a nutcase, you've got a screw loose, you're bonkers. The terms are all derogatory.
Yes, it was a stigma, wasn't it? It was a thing of menace. I think it has changed. I think the image of this place in its later years was a far more positive one. To have achieved in its recent lifetime such a change from the image to the real concept of a place of sanctuary, a true asylum, I think that was quite an achievement.
It was a stigma to have been there, wasn't it? to have been to the hospital. But not now, is it? That has gone. I mean, you take it as an illness, same as any other illness. I mean, if you have appendicitis, you go into hospital. Because this is the brain, it's still an illness, isn't it?
If you break a leg, or whatever, if you've got a physical ailment, you go to your doctor and nobody says, oh my God, she's gone to the doctor because she's broken a leg. What a fool to break a leg. But if you go to the doctor and you say to your friends, well, actually, I've had a nervous breakdown, or, you know, I wanted to commit suicide, they sort of stand back and think, oh dear, what's wrong with her? And it has an incredibly negative feel to it. People are frightened of it.
Within Denbigh, there isn't the barriers, of course, because children grow up, their parents, their relatives have worked in the hospital. They know about the hospital from a very early age. Children in Denbigh use the hospital grounds as a playground. They play soccer on the fields and whatnot. But for people further afield, especially if you're playing in Gwynedd or somewhere like that and you went to play soccer, the people there were a little bit suspicious of when we went to play. But when they came here and they had to, of course they had a bath in the hospital and they had their meal in the hospital, and they could go from here and perhaps break down a few barriers back home, because the stigma is one of the biggest problems we've always had. We were playing in a cup match in Llanllechid, and Llanllechid, a very good side. I don't know if they are now, I've lost touch a bit, but they were then, and we were playing in a cup match. And of course there is the stigma, so we'd gone all the way down there to play in a soccer match, and we got off the bus and we changed and we went out on the field, and a very partisan crowd shouting, and of course I suppose looking for some chance to level against us. I mean, they knew who we were and where we come from. They were calling us Denbigh loonies. And I remember one of the side turning to them and said, if you don't stop shouting at us, we're going to let the staff come down to play you next week. And the rumour must have got around the field because they went very quiet afterwards.
Activities of the hospital exist. Annual reports, committee minutes, registers of patients, building extension plans. They all reveal that there has always been a strong connection between the town of Denbigh and the hospital. And the trust between the two, built up for about 150 years, was unique.
When I first came up to the hospital to look at the material which would have to be dealt with, I was astounded to see the amount of paperwork involved. I've had a great interest in local history for many, many years, particularly in the history of this town. And when the opportunity presented itself to examine and to sift out some of the documents that were available in the North Wales Hospital, I availed myself of the opportunity to be involved in the sorting out, and it's proved very, very interesting and profitable. Probably. I've always found myself having a very close interest in the hospital. It may be particularly because my family has been quite closely connected with it over the years. My grandfather was first appointed here as a keeper, that's what they called the nurses many years ago, in the 1880s. He was almost a monoglot Welshman, but his main attributes were that he was a large man and particularly strong. And this, of course, was what was necessary for the curtailment of the patients themselves. My brother worked here in the kitchen for many years. My wife has worked here for 2 long periods. I have 1, 2, 3 sisters-in-law and 2 brothers-in-law who've been on the nursing staff here, so I think it can be well said that I've got a very close association with this hospital.
My mother had worked here, so I did know something about the place. And then obviously a number of my friends from school came to work here when they left school. So to people in Denbigh, it wasn't felt to be something odd or strange that you were coming to work into this type of hospital. It was just quite a normal thing to do.
I started work here in 1964 as a stores porter. The North Wales Hospital was obviously the main area of employment in the town of Denbigh, and my family, one of my sisters was a nurse here, my mother worked here, and this is where I think they chose for me to come to work. And I'm very grateful for that, because I've spent 31 years at the North Wales Hospital and they've been very happy years.
I was born and brought up in Denbigh, and as a child I didn't have any direct contacts with the hospital. I didn't have close members of the family working here, so I didn't know much about it, and I must admit, to me it was a bit of an unknown quantity. What I can remember vividly is going to stay in Wrexham for summer holidays, and when my friends asked me where I lived and I said Denbigh, they would just laugh and say, ho, 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 they've opened the gates. So that was a bit of a problem, really, I must admit, in those days. As far as the town's concerned, I mean, I think most people knew the hospital and knew the patients and felt fairly comfortable.
The fences, the walls, the airing courts, they've been long time gone, really. This has been an open hospital as far as my memory serves me. The patients had free access in the grounds, they had ground parole, and they also had, on certain days, town parole. Those days were Wednesday, Saturday and Sunday, and nurses were designated with the task of going and checking on these people in town. Nobody relished the idea, because you had to keep on going into licensed premises and checking whether there was any clients inside the premises. And the licensees quite often knew the regulars. There were a couple of patients from this hospital who were still able to purchase a pint of ale for twopence. Nobody else in Denbigh was able to at those prices, but he felt that they'd been going there so long that he let them have them for twopence. But if he felt that there was anybody there behaving suspiciously, he would let you know when you went in, so that you could mark it down in the book, and when you came back to the hospital, sometimes you had to tackle complete strangers. And even though they were behaving suspiciously, they went from the hospital, so you really felt quite foolish.
January 1852. Admittance of female patient. What's your name?
Mary Lloyd.
How old are you?
63.
Where are you from?
I'm from the Vale of Clwyd.
Are you married?
Yes, to a farmer.
Medical certificate. This poor woman was seen by Mr. Lloyd Williams' son a few days ago at her home, where he found her confined in a straitjacket and confined to the bed by a cart rope, in which same state she has been the last 9 months.
It was Easter 1990. I was very, very depressed. I had a lot of problems in my life at the time. And a massive part of me decided that I didn't want to go on anymore. I wanted to kill myself. I'd had enough of all this dreadful thing called life. But a teeny weeny bit of me actually thought, maybe that's how you feel now. Perhaps, you know, in a week or so you'll feel differently. So I went toddling down to my local doctor and said, look, I'm very depressed. You've given me medication. They're not working. I think I'm going to try to kill myself. And being the person I am, if I try, I'll succeed. But part of me is not convinced it's what I really want to do. So he said to me, look, all I can do is put you into Denbigh. And I said, well, do it. And he said, do you realise what you're doing? And I said, do it. And I have to say, that was Easter Monday, and I was going on the Tuesday, and I did think about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And I did think, I'm going to get in there. They're going to realise that I should have been locked up years ago, and I'll never be released.
This person should be discharged. He shouldn't be in a hospital. And
I had about 800 or 900 female patients under my care, with 2 or 3 assistants. So to each of them I said, if I make you a voluntary patient, will you stay here until I discharge you? And they all said yes, so I made them all voluntary. So, you know, after a few months, nearly all the certification stopped. But my next job was to find a bed for that night, for the next emergency admission. There were about 1,600 beds, and you could say practically all of them were occupied. The place was jammed to the eaves. There were wards of 80 and 90 people. There was a sick ward where you had to wriggle your way between beds. The overcrowding was appalling.
Well, this ward was known in my time as Male 6 or Francon ward. It was a 60-bedded ward, and it was known as the refractory ward. Locked doors for the nursing of acute male disturbed patients. It was quite a difficult place to work, and most of the admissions that came in on sections, compulsory admissions, came in here. Any patient that was deemed a danger to themselves or to others were nursed here, and all the patients that were difficult to nurse within the hospital were nursed here. So you can imagine it was a pretty difficult ward to work on. 60 beds in the one area where we're sitting now, pretty cramped, no rooms for lockers. Patients bundled their clothing up under the beds, no rooms to go between the bed to make them. You had to push the beds together to make the beds. So a very difficult ward to work on, and generally only 4 staff for the 60 patients.
A number of the wards, in fact, the majority of the wards up to the Second World War didn't have bathrooms, and so each ward had their morning or afternoon for using the central bathroom, which consisted of 6 baths in a row, and the patients were taken with their bundle of clean clothing along the corridors up to the baths, and then they were each bathed 6 at a time in the baths, and then dressed, and then brought back again all together to the ward.
By studying the case notes, we're really only getting the doctor's view of what was happening. We're not getting a day-to-day view of what was happening in the hospital necessarily. And many of the case notes become very repetitive. You can see the process of institutionalization. You can see the patient, in a sense, losing identity. So I suppose it's the ones who determinedly try to assert their identity that stand out. And there's one lady who stands out. When they arrived at the hospital, of course, they had to take all their clothes off, and they had to put on hospital clothes. So that immediately, you know, stripped you of a lot of your identity. But there was one girl who, when she arrived, looked in absolute horror at the patient uniform and said that she couldn't possibly wear those. She was aristocratically brought up and wasn't going to put them on. She had to, of course, so she had to find some other way of showing. And she went round collecting snail shells, and she made little earrings that she hung on herself. And again, I've got quite fond of some of the doctors who've, you know, taken the trouble to actually note these little points down.
The 5th of April, 1896. Name?
Trevor Lewis.
Pauper?
No.
Age?
19.
Where are you from?
Denbigh.
Previous occupation?
Bank clerk.
He has been in seclusion since June the 22nd and had the floors padded with mattresses. He has had to be fed twice a day with a tube. Took half a dozen attendants to hold him. Every day he was violent, kicking and striking.
There was no guards on the gates. It was amazing. And I couldn't see bars in the windows either. But I thought it's probably inside. So I got taken down to an annex, and I don't remember too much about it. And I saw a psychiatrist who wasn't wearing a white coat, who looked quite normal. Everybody around there looked quite normal as well, which quite surprised me, I must say. They took my medication off me and said, if you want it, you can have it, but you're going to have to ask for it. That again surprised me, because I thought I would be sort of held down and force-fed drugs and all the rest of it. I got taken up to a dormitory. Now this again surprised me, because I'd envisaged sort of steel beds and dirty windows and hardwood floors. And this is really nice. It's a bit like a dormitory at school with pretty curtains on the windows and all the rest of it, and a lot of privacy. And a young nurse sat down with me, and I burst into tears and poured my heart out. And she had tremendous empathy and sympathy and listened to me. I then got taken downstairs into what I can only describe as a large, airy lounge with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out, not through bars, but onto well-kept lawns, and beyond that onto a field with sheep grazing in it. And one of my lasting memories is, I wonder how the farmer feels about having a nut house so close to his farm, and does he ever think of the screwballs escaping? But it was all terribly normal, which I did find quite disturbing, because I thought I could be doing this in my own home.
Good morning, Northwest Hospital.
Back in the 1950s, there were about 1,500 patients at the hospital. And one of the big reasons for that was that the treatments that had been developed over the previous 15 or 20 years were not very effective, although they claimed that they were effective in some instances. There were a number of physical treatments like insulin shock treatments and prefrontal leucotomy. The ECT, of course, was developed, and it's the only one of those treatments that has stayed until today.
Well, in the early days, they used to do ECT without any sedation, and it wasn't very pleasant to watch for the either for the client or for the nurse to witness, you know, because we had to hold down the shoulders and the pelvis of the patient to minimize the risk of fractures, because it would be like a full-blown epileptic seizure without any sedation or muscle relaxants.
Malarial treatment was another strange kind of treatment where they would infect the patient with the malaria to try to cure them of syphilis. But then in the 1950s, they developed a number of drug treatments, the principal one being Largactil, and that really revolutionized the treatment of people with schizophrenia. It seemed to have the effect, although they weren't sure how it was going to work, but it seemed to have the effect in two ways. That those people who previously had been quite disturbed and aggressive were calmed by the drug. But also, strangely enough, those people who had been mute and uncommunicative suddenly started to talk again.
I remember drugs like epineutin and phenobarb and all those being introduced to the hospital for the first time. It made a big difference, especially to epileptics, and whereas they weren't having anything at all before, you see. And Largactil was, well, it was revolutionary, in fact. So many patients improved with Largactil, and many, many of them went home, whereas they'd been there for years, some of them.
By the end of the 1950s, the hospital, which until then had been completely locked, all the wards had been locked, and the outer doors, you couldn't get in here, and obviously you couldn't get out of here very easily. It was opened up.
Ready for the archives, the hospital staff have the arduous task of transferring the more recent records to the appropriate North Wales counties. Considering that when the National Health Service came into existence, this hospital was already 100 years old, there is a wealth of experience and memories being stacked away here.
Do you want any more boxes?
From its modest beginnings in 1848 with only 20 staff, the hospital grew until it employed about 500.
This hospital is not especially privileged, either in money or in extra staff. Its progress has been due to its own efforts, and the extent of the progress is reflected in the unmistakable cheerfulness of both staff and patients.
I came here from Swansea. My coming here was a result of a report that came out in nursing management called the Salmon Report, where it was decided that instead of having a male and female side to mental hospitals, they should be run as one hospital. In fact, Denbigh at all times was one of the forerunners in treatment for patients, and they were very quick to change policy and appoint somebody to merge the two sides. It wasn't a very difficult task, because one thing that impressed me when I came here was the quality of staff. I worked in other hospitals before I came here, and the first priority, in my view, by all grades of staff here was patient care. And I do believe patients here got first-class care.
The place was a hive of activity. There was something going on all the time here. The recreation hall was used every night and at the weekends. We had a cinema show once a week. We had a dance once a week. Then we had bingo sessions and whist drives, beetle drives. And it was really an extremely active place, and a lot of enjoyment was had by the patients and the staff themselves.
We used to have an Eisteddfod every year, and we used to make them all take part in something or other. And we had a choir, and we had a band, and to get those patients on that stage was quite an achievement, because they like to hold back. But when I got them patients on the stage, it made my day. Not so much the winning, but getting them on that stage made my day.
Well, as a student nurse, I was in the rock and roll era and knew nothing about formal dancing. But coming here as a student nurse, every Wednesday evening was patients' dance night, and you were directed to take patients to the hall to the dances. Once there, the rule was you never danced with female staff. You only danced with the female patients. And if you were a little bit slow in coming forward, you were told by some of the staff there, get over there and ask her to dance, or she would be sent over to ask you, a female patient would ask you to dance. And of course the dances were foreign to me. The Velita, the military two-step, the Palais glide, and the waltz and the slow foxtrot. But the patients, of course, knew them. And I had to learn very, very quickly how to do them, and I did. And so did a lot of the staff here.
There was a lot going on here, and it was, for many years, like a large village. I mean, you can imagine with 1,500 patients here, it was probably larger than the largest village in North Wales.
Once a year, they had their grand ball, which is a magnificent event, really. The female patients all had ball gowns. The seamstress would help them perhaps run something up. The male patients were all in suits, some of them in dicky bows and dark suits, and the hall was packed, and all the staff, even staff off duty, came up, and they had a master of ceremonies, and the staff band would play.
"19th of February 1906. Left today with her husband in the best of spirits. A nice little woman who had become a great favourite here, stout and well in health.
Her husband had, against her wishes, moved to a new residence. and closer to his people, who she did not care for. The news of her death was received here with surprise and the greatest regret by all who knew her.
I then got told to go down to the dining room for dinner, and really that was the worst experience I had, because I walked in there on my own and I stood in the middle of the floor and I just looked at the floor with my head bowed, and I was 5 years old again, my first day at school, and the adult in me was saying, what am I doing in a mental hospital? I must be off my head. Anyway, this girl came over and took me by the hand and sat me down and got me some food and all the rest of it, a dark-haired girl, I can't remember her name, and she kept bursting out laughing and apologising and saying she wasn't laughing at me. And it turned out that she was actually quite a bad case, she wasn't at all well. And the overriding thing about Denbigh that I found was the help that was given to you, not just by the staff, but by your fellow residents. They really cared and looked out for each other.
BRYN Hospital in Colwyn Bay, one of 3 new developments in Clwyd. The others are at the Milor in Wrexham and at Glan Clwyd in Bodilwyddan. This hospital will be the small satellite base for the elderly people with mental illness, as well as housing a day hospital for 20 places. The staff are today preparing this new hospital for the arrival of patients from the North Wales Hospital, Denbigh. Some of those patients have been at Denbigh for a considerable time. And this ward will be one of the last to leave after a decommissioning period of about 10 years.
Look at me and big smiles.
Yes, lovely.
Okay?
Yeah.
There we are.
It was nice, wasn't it? I won't. But right, it doesn't cost anything.
Coming with us.
Vera. Vera, you'll have to go on the roof.
I suppose they also did develop quite close relationships with staff here, and they weren't made to feel different or odd. And of course we've got to move on. I mean, these places have served their usefulness.
Ruby looks positive.
Yeah, she does.
Doesn't she?
Yeah. Bye, Ralphie.
Oh, everywhere.
Don't cry, Lorraine.
Well, that's it. I'll go back to it.
Although my feelings are tinged with a bit of sadness because of losing all the social side of the hospital and so on, I still think on balance that what we are doing is the best for the majority of people.
There are patients who will always need hospitalisation. I don't care what people say, they should be out in the community. I don't believe that. I know there are plenty who are in the hospital who should have been out, but there are still plenty more who need to be in a hospital and to be supervised. That's what's lacking, the supervision.
If what they are providing in the community is what they said, which is going to be better than what they provided in Denbigh, then they're going to have to spend a considerable amount of money. If we cared for them every day, 24 hours a day, by a full team of nursing, social, medical staff, if they're transferring that out in the community, that's well and good. But at the moment, care seems to cease at 5 o'clock on a Friday and doesn't recommence until 9 o'clock on a Monday.
When I look back and think of the standard of care, and I'm mentioning this again, I do wonder if in fact satellites in various other places will ever be able to have the expertise that seemed to me to be under one roof here.
As far as the closure is concerned, I think we all have very mixed emotions about it, really. It's very sad. It's sad for the town of Denbigh. It's sad in many ways for the people who've worked here and the people who've been treated here. But on the other hand, it's also, I feel, very exciting. It's exciting that the new services are starting up. Obviously, they've been well established for the last few years, and I suppose the closure of Denbigh will almost be like cutting the umbilical cord and leaving them to operate on their own, which will be quite a worrying time, I suppose, for everybody. But I must say, I do believe that providing services nearer to people's homes is the right way forward as far as psychiatry is concerned for the 90s and into the next century. I really do believe that North Wales Hospital has served a very important function, but that function has now passed, and it's time to move on to more appropriate services in the community.
There's MAUDE, yes. Yes, there is. And we were singing in the staff night, we was a bit drunk. She's died, 45. And Dorothy Rogers, yes.
We've actually organised a reunion, and I must admit, I feel that's a very important part of the closure, part of the project that we've been doing, really, because I think it's giving people an opportunity to say goodbye, to almost deal with their feelings, if you like, by getting together and seeing old friends and saying goodbye to the place. I think it could also be seen as almost like mourning. So I think that's going to be a very important occasion, and I think it's been very important that we've been able to do that.
Then I went to Female 9, Sister Maya. Then I went to Female 8 with Latona Ilditch. And then 7B with Margaret Davies. Davies, that's it, yeah. Yes, the Dragon.
I saw the place as a place of excellence. We took a place which was grey and old and did carry some stigma. And I think in this quarter of a century, it's been changed into something which was very vigorous and was a proper, intensive medical thing in North Wales. Yes, that has been a matter of great pride and satisfaction.
There were good things that happened here, and in fact, in the last 50 years or so, this hospital was regarded as one of the top psychiatric hospitals in the country. So it's important, I think, to hang on to those things that we learnt over those years so that we can develop and improve all the time.
I've got no doubt at all that not just the staff at Denbigh, who showed tremendous compassion, understanding and empathy, but also my fellow residents there did so much for me that a bottle of pills couldn't have done. It was just talking and being understood. Denbigh saved my life.
Bed curtains, not the tracking, the 6 curtains that are hanging in that ward. There we are, number 22. What may I say for those? Anybody give £10 for the 6? 5 bid, £5 a bid now at 5 for the curtains at 5, 8, £8, £8 a bid there at 8, £8 offered at £8 a bid. Anybody giving any more at £8? You bidding? £10. I'm selling this time then at 10. This side, £10. Thank you.
£30, 30, £30, 5 now. £30 bid, £30, are you all done? 5, 35, 40, 45, 50, £50, 5, 50, 60, £60 out that side now, sold and done, finished at 5, 65, 70, £70, sold again, done at 75, 75, 80, £80, sold again this time, £80 number, sir. 131, £80. Another one, the same sort of thing. 680 again, £40 again, £20 bid, 30, 40, 50, £50 the other table, £50 bid, 50, 60, £60, 70, £70, 80, £80, sold this time, lose it, finish the far side, a 5, 85, £85, 90 madam, sold, £85, thank you sir, number please. 489.